Thanks. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to episode 6 of the Gateway House Weekly podcast. Episode 6 is Alibaba, Amazon, and Jio. And what's making, why this podcast? I think two big factors which have been COVID resistant are the Amazon stock price, which has gone up by 30% since the onset of the pandemic, and the Jio platform has attracted, based on various reports available in the public domain and filing, $10 billion in the last 4 to 6 weeks. What's making India such an attractive destination, be it Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, Walmart, Amazon, and Facebook, is a very vibrant digital economy. We have 450 million users in the internet, cheap data, high smartphone penetration, but most important, a $750 billion retail industry, of which 90% is in the unorganized sector, and about 12 million what we call Kirana stores, globally known as mom and pop stores. What we want to achieve from this panel, and before I introduce my panel, is protection for the consumer, a level playing field for all the investors. We do not want the Amazonization of India, and big tech is here to stay. We at Gateway House welcome FPI as long as it's coming from liberal democracies where there's a rule of law. And to kind of achieve the above three objectives, I have a fabulous panel with me, starting with Mr. Syngal, who's had a long innings in the telecom sector, moving from state-controlled telecom to the privatization of telecom, and he's written a recent book called The Telecom Man, which you must read. Tiff Roberts, Dexter Roberts, or Tiff Roberts, has had a ringside view of Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent, as he was the China Bureau for Business Week, and also has a bestseller to his name titled The Myth of Chinese Capitalism. Lauri, Rechardt, the Chief Legal Officer of IFPI, has been in the trenches working with the EU and the regulators in the EU, be it on GDPR or on amendments to ensure that there is protection for copyright. I'll go straight to my panelist, and my first question is direct to Mr. Syngal. Syngal sir, techno-nationalism is worrisome to a lot of policy wonks who are championing to see an even playing field for all the e-commerce investments that are coming into our economy. The walled garden is an area of paramount concern. Are our existing laws governing telecom and monopolies sufficient to regulate these companies, or do we need to amend those laws? That's my question to Mr. Syngal. Mr. Syngal? Okay, we've lost him. Tiff, I'll come to you. Elizabeth Warren spoke about breaking up big tech. Okay, that's still a discussion which will kind of rise as we move closer to November 2022. In China, the CCP government models leads and technology is the instrument. Outside China, technology is leading governments. We've had a ringside view in China, and you probably have a ringside view now in the United States. India is at the beginning of this long marathon. What are the mistakes that China made? What are the mistakes that America made? And what we should avoid is my question to you. Syngal Sahab, I'll come back to you later.
Well, to understand where China is today, you really need to look at the nature of the relationship between its biggest companies, and these are both the state companies and the private companies. And if you look at the relationship that Alibaba has had with the CCP, which is the Chinese government, it's very much a symbiotic relationship. And it's interesting because the CCP does not always manage it with outright clear regulations, but often it sort of nudges it. Alibaba knows that it needs to fulfill certain government goals in order to actually do business in China. So what is the symbiotic relationship between the CCP and Alibaba? Well, I would say, first of all, Alibaba, and this is very true now with the economic downturn and the impact to exports that is very much hitting China. Alibaba has a key role in playing as a jobs provider within China. A lot of those jobs actually go to the more vulnerable people, like factory workers that would be producing the products that are sold on the Alibaba platform, but also to across the board. Also, another example would be delivery courier people, who often are migrants as well. So that's one key role that Alibaba has, but it extends much further than that. Alibaba, for example, has a video production arm, Alibaba Pictures. They've been producing, I don't think there's anything other way to describe it, but propaganda films actually about the efforts to combat COVID-19. And you know, they have other roles. They've played a big important role in trying to deal with the gap between urban China and rural China through their it's called Nongsun Taobao, their rural Taobao program. So Alibaba knows that it needs to fulfill these goals, and it very much does. And it's also clear that once it's reached any company, including private companies, when they reach a certain scale in China, they have to make sure that they are doing these or meeting these needs of the government or the CCP. So that's a long way of saying it's a little bit hard to extend this model beyond China's borders. In other words, the role between the companies and the party or the government is very special within China.
Okay. Fine, thank you for that explanation. And is there anything that we kind of need to be kind of wary about since we're at the beginning of this marathon? And any comments from the American side?
Well, again, I hate to say this, but it is such a different system in China. And I was there for about 23 years until less than 2 years ago. And to watch the rise of companies within China, when I arrived there, there wasn't really even much of a private sector to speak of, to what we have now with these enormous world-beating private companies in China has been fascinating. The parallels are hard to draw with the U.S. market. The system is so very, very different.
Thank you for that. Mr. Syngal, can you hear me? Can you read me, Mr. Syngal?
Yes, please, I can.
Okay. Sir, to kind of ensure a level playing field and ensure that the walled garden is not walled, are our laws good enough, or we need to kind of amend the rules and the laws that are there currently prevailing to ensure that everybody, every investor who has entered the e-commerce business has a level playing field? Lauri, I'll come to you. I think I've lost Mr. Syngal again. You've kind of worked closely on, you've kind of had a ringside view of GDPR and, you know, liabilities of content liabilities on the platforms. GDPR eventually, apparently the verdict is it's not going to it's actually going to help big tech rather than, ensure that the small and medium scale platforms get protected. Any comments that India needs to watch out for as we move on to this journey?
Well, thanks, Blaise. I mean, look, I think GDPR is obviously an very important and influential part of the regulation, but I think it really is a sort of part of a broader picture. I mean, GDPR, as you know, regulates the use of private, if you will, private data, private or personal data. So use, collection, processing, so forth, which is absolutely crucial in the new data economy. That's for sure. And I think the basic aim with GDPR really is to give consumers more sort of say in how their data, which is kind of the rocket fuel of the data economy is used and by whom. But at the same time, the way I see it, and I think, what we are seeing, that sort of the picture emerging definitely in Europe, but I think also in other parts of the world, is that sort of the platform economy can't be left totally unregulated. And there are more and more calls to review the laws that then sort of shape up the economy, and we are looking at, for instance, and maybe in particular, competition law. How is competition law applied in this new environment? And in that context, again, actually, how data is being used and by whom and under what conditions is a very important aspect. And maybe the old, if you will, competition law doctrines, antitrust doctrines, do not always entirely sort of function, or they are not suited to dealing with it, the issues that the new economy is throwing up. And then the last point is, again, which is a horizontal issue, which is sort of broadly speaking, what responsibilities should the big tech, and in particular, sort of two-sided user upload content platforms have. I mean, since the early 2000s, what we have seen is kind of, there's been a sort of a major policy pivot in favor, if you will, of the sort of the internet intermediaries, and at that point, probably for a good reason, to allow the the internet and the sort of the digital marketplace to develop and flourish. But at this point, I think there is an emerging consensus that maybe that policy pivot needs to be shifted, if you will, back closer to center, and at least some of these platforms should be treated more like publishers rather than mere sort of post offices. And that's definitely, we are seeing now in Europe, there's the flagship project of the new commission for the next 5 years is something called Digital Services Act, which is very essentially looking at reviewing the responsibilities of digital platforms.
Thank you, Lauri. That's great insights, especially when it comes to Jio and Facebook, because both are very, very data-rich companies. One as a telco and one as a platform. I think it needs kind of, this is great inputs to kind of look at what we need to do in terms of protecting the consumer, as also protecting content in terms of Jio being an intermediary. Mr. Syngal, can you kind of read us? Can you reach us? Can you hear us? Because I have one question for you, which is very important from an India point of view. Mr. Syngal?
Are you getting me now?
I can hear you. Mr. Syngal, my question to you is, I can hear you. Mr. Syngal, my question to you is, to ensure a level playing field and the walled garden is not walled, are the laws in India adequate, or they need to be relooked and amended?
I think it's Mr. Fernandes, it's a very valid and relevant question, and let me quickly respond to this. My first response is that all companies, if they are registered as Indian companies under the Indian Companies Act, must be given equal opportunity to conduct business in India. There should not be any differentiation whether it's a homegrown company or whether it's a company which has opened its offices here to conduct business. You see, the problem has been that we in India post-regulate and not pre-regulate, by which what I mean is that you start a match without rules and regulations. And that happens both because of I would say, the urge of the foreign companies to start business. So they enter into the Indian market without to have a foothold and start the business. But let's take the example of the topic under discussion. Let's take the Amazons or the Walmart, etc. The e-commerce policy is still works in progress. and there is no clarity. The reason being that the rules were not framed. The companies ventured into India, and once the companies have ventured into India, they are looking at solutions now as to how they should be treated equally. That's the big problem which we have today. And from my own telecom experience, I can say that the competition in India started in 1994, but the regulator came in 97. So it's a post-regulation. It has been some sort of a norm that we have post-regulation and not pre-regulation. The pre-regulation gives you the benefit that you know what are the rules of the game, and therefore when you enter a market, you are aware of the pitfalls and you are aware of the pluses and the minuses. Just jumping quickly today, in today's environment, on privacy, data localization, on
net neutrality.
Net neutrality, we are still unclear. It's all work in progress. For example, even the definition of what is personal data, what is critical personal data, what is sensitive personal data, there is a committee which is in the works and trying to find definitions for that. But then we have this personal data protection bill, which is under discussion by a JPC. Now, I call it putting the cart before the horse. Now, what are we discussing there when you don't have a clarity as to what is the definition of various forms of data? And privacy.
No, I got you on data. I think our data, we kind of got some clarity that we have. For me, the biggest worry is the walled garden on net neutrality, because in one particular case, you have a telco who's getting into e-commerce. The others are not telcos. And my particular worry is about net neutrality in the walled gardens. So how can we put a level playing field?
Okay. It's a very big worry for the telcos who do not or who haven't joined hands with the likes of Facebook. You could have free basic problem. You could have net neutrality problem. More so and importantly is the fact that with a Jio and Facebook combination, they could have a position in the marketplace to offer incentives. You see, WhatsApp application is on all telephones with all operators. But with Jio WhatsApp application, what could happen is that they may get incentives for make purchases on Jio Mart or other Jio facilities and enticed to move away from Vodafone or Airtel to their network. So that gives them a very, very undue advantage. So therefore, the Competition Commission should look at as to what could be in what manner would they put the other companies, telcos into a disadvantageous position, could result in a monopolistic situation.
Thanks for that, Mr. Syngal, because that's exactly the big concern. So I think the CCI of India got a big role to play in making sure that there's a level playing field for all the investors, be it domestic investors or international investors. I'll come back to the panel. Today, we live in a tripolar world. So we've got the rules. China has a separate set of rules. America has a separate set of rules. The EU has a separate set of rules. And I think a lot of the emerging markets are looking at India to kind of set a couple of rules in cyber security, cyberspace, e-commerce that they can adopt. Any recommendations on the basis of the mistakes that have taken place, be it in Europe, America, or China, that India should be mindful of? I'll start with you, Tiff.
Well, I'd start by just noting that China obviously is very ambitious about global rule setting and standards right now, and even with the present crisis, we've seen China trying to even more aggressively sort of export its technology to the world. It's been sending teams to show how to use, for example, telecoms to better monitor the spread of diseases into different countries. So I think whereas the rest of the world, the emerging world, may be looking to India, I think China is very determined also to play a key role in any sort of global technology practice standards going forward. So I think that's something that we should all be mindful of. I also think, well, I'm perhaps a little bit alarmed by that, because I hear all the other speakers talking about, for example, privacy issues and so on. And I do believe those are very, very important. But I'm not so sure that as China tries to push its standards globally, that it will be focused on put an enormous amount of emphasis on issues like privacy. As you probably are well aware, China has a long practice of demanding that its telecom companies share data with the government. And often they do that in a very opaque fashion. We don't actually know what's shared. The Chinese people don't know what's shared, but we do know that it is being shared. Sometimes it's for censorship. Sometimes it's for, there are other national goals. I think I'll just stop there.
Okay, thank you.
And hand it to the speakers.
Thank you. Lauri, is there anything that India should be mindful of, or are you optimistic that India probably do better in terms of net neutrality and data privacy? We learn from the mistakes of the EU and we'll come up with a model for the emerging world. Lauri?
Well, look, I would want to pick up slightly different, but obviously very related issue, and that's the sort of the liability rules that govern the ISPs, where we've seen, and I already mentioned that the ISP liability rules, also AKA safe harbor rules, which exempts certain ISPs from liability under certain conditions, and what we have seen is that the safe harbors granted, they still play an important role, but what is abundantly clear now is that those exemptions need to be reviewed in order to ensure that the platforms that have become major distributors of content, different kinds of content, that they if you will, they carry their responsibilities in a more robust manner than so far. And the problem that we have faced, and I think music industry there has been really kind of in the sort of forefront, is that instead of, if you will, a sustainable and balanced economic growth, we have in some respects seen what might be called parasitic growth, where yes, there's been growth, but it has been very unevenly and unfairly, if you will, distributed, which is not good for the general economy and definitely not good for the consumers either. So that's definitely an area, a policy area, which I think India should be very mindful of. And as said, we are seeing now kind of this kind of revision or review taking already place at least in Europe.
Thank you, Lauri. I think that's a great takeaway in terms of liabilities of the platforms. Mr. Syngal, your last closing comment, having seen this closely, your last closing comment in terms of, are you optimistic that India can be the beacon of hope to the emerging world in this tripolar cyber world?
I would say yes. I think slowly and steadily we are moving towards that direction. For example, if the outcome of PDP, etc., comes to fruition quickly, and setting up of the data regulator to decide as to what should be shared, what should be localized, and what is private, gets a clarity. So the very thought of setting up a data regulator is a step forward and could be a pointer for other nations to pick the threats from there. That's my belief.
Thank you very much.